What's up, guys? Thanks for joining another episode of Cars, Bikes, and Coffee. I am Kurt, and we are working on a 1992 300ZX twin turbo. And in the last episode, we went and worked on the engine bay. We refurbished the wiring harness. We replaced some old, cracked, drying rubber hoses to silicone. And today we need to finish off the engine bay by putting together a few things. We've got the plenum right here, we've got some throttle bodies, and even the accelerator drum that goes in the center that we need to rebuild. So we've gone and had some parts because they were too large for my plating setup, so I sent them away to Automotive Restoration Services, and I'll leave his link down below. Awesome work, came out perfect, and really was an easy process. So we've got some new hoses, we've got bearings, we've got the works. So we're gonna get going on working on this plenum. So where we're gonna start on the plenum is really just putting in some of the quick things, you know, some of the hose bibs that we just need to put some sealant on and thread those in. We've got the PCV valves, brand new, and these things, they kind of work, but the new ones sound a whole lot better, so we're gonna replace those. And of course, we have all the shiny bits that we need to assemble and put them back on the throttle bodies. So I'm gonna do some of this off camera just to speed it up a little bit. All right, so we've got IACV in the back and their connecting hose, of course. Got some of the hose and the ends and the bracket for the cruise control and the throttle cables, and as well on both sides the PCV. So what we need to do now is assemble the accelerator drum assembly, replace the bearings on each side. And so we've got the plastic bearings that everything from this, the throttle bodies and the drum, the plastic bearings just disintegrated. So I was able to find from Igus is the company. They have the bearings. I might need to cut them down. They are just plastic, but this is what they look like. And so we've got those so we can rebuild the throttle bodies and the accelerator drum. So I'll come back and show you how we did those. All right, so we've got some of the parts put onto the intake plenum, and of course, we've got the throttle bodies all assembled, and they look 1,000 times better. Even have the accelerator drum all put together. So what we want to do now is use our Z-spec bolts, get these all installed. We're going to start with the accelerator drum in the center, and then we'll put on the throttle bodies on the side. All right, so this looks 100,000 times better than it did before. Now the Z-spec bolts that we use on the throttle body and the accelerator drum, those we just needed to put a little bit of Loctite and get those snugged up, put new gaskets in, of course, for the throttle bodies, but now it's ready to get back on the car. So we'll go ahead and do that. And we have the gaskets for the intake plenum and of course the EGR pipes. So we'll go ahead, get that on. All right, so we've got our gasket in place and we've got our EGR gaskets in place, and we're gonna carefully drop this in here. And just slowly align everything. We've got our new silicone PVC hoses in. Just make sure we're not pinching any wires or cables or hoses. And then somehow, carefully place on the PCV valve hose. Now we have our Z-spec bolt set. So we're gonna go ahead and start putting that together and then placing them in to make sure we've got our gasket nicely aligned, and then slowly begin to place the bolts and tighten them up. All right, so we've got the intake plenum in and started putting some of the bits in and together, but this looks 1,000 times better. I know it's in the bright sun, but what we want to do now is put the balance bar on and start just getting everything else connected. Went ahead and wired in or connected the injectors. And we'll just put the coil packs in. I want to look at the spark plugs one more time, but just getting everything routed and all set. That way we're almost done with this engine bay. So off camera, I went ahead and put on our silicone hoses for the intakes, and of course use our bolt kit from Z-Spec, and got that all installed, and it's looking great. And so what I want to do now is get the cruise control actuator dressed up a little bit. There's something from Z-Spec that we've got, and also went ahead and kind of cleaned up and painted, and also used Z-Spec bolts for the coil packs. So that was just a nice kind of clean look that they gave. So I'm going to go ahead and go in the garage, and we're going to clean up the cruise control piece, and then we'll get it installed in the engine bay. All right, so we have our cruise control actuator assembly, and this is the Z-Spec kit that you can get to dress up and make it look a little nicer. And this is great for me. In my case, I didn't want to replate all this stuff at this time and take it all apart. This is kind of an easy solution since I had all the oxidation in the engine bay. And what this does is you just take out these screws, and this slides over, and then you use the supplied bolts and tighten those up. And then for the cover, just clean this up, and then this has double-sided tape, and that sticks right on. So kind of an easy solution for me in my case. And so I'm gonna go ahead and just clean up these two covers and then install it. All right, so we've already gone ahead and waxed this area. So what we want to do is put our solenoid bracket down and our cruise control, and with our Z-Spec bolts, we're gonna mount that up. Now, one thing you'll notice is I didn't use the Z-Spec bolts because those were threaded, and this is a plastic screw. So I had to reuse these. So I'm gonna go see if I can find at the hardware store some stainless steel replacements, or even some yellow chromate like bolts, like this bracket right here. So putting some finishing touches on the engine, and one thing with the coil packs is before I put those in, I did check the spark plugs, and actually they were gapped for 30 thou and a little too tight. So put them out to 35, and we'll see how they run from there. And then did a grounding, got from this strut tower to the plenum, and then around to the back to the factory grounding spot, and then the second grounding spot on the back of the plenum, and then over to the other strut tower, and then to the battery ground. So that should help maybe a little bit, as well as run through that hole in the boot that we had is our 3 sensors. That is for our turbo boost vacuum gauge and our water temp, and then our oil temp. So the water temp runs from up here all the way around with a wiring loom, and then our sensor for our turbo is right here, runs to our balance bar, and then the oil sensor or oil temp sensor goes from there down along the heat shield by the turbo and to the oil filter at the bottom. So now what we want to do, since we have those wires run to the inside, I want to show you how we're going to use the gauges and how we're going to install them in the car. All right, so the way I like to do my builds is I want to keep it kind of clean and kind of stock, or as close to as possible. I think A-pillar gauge pods are great. For me, I think they're too busy in the, in your view. And so what I want to do is go ahead and use the stereo trim bezel, and then I was able to find, which these are hard to find now, is the gauge pod that fits in the bottom stereo pocket. And so what we need to do is just scuff up the trim bezel for this area, and just give something the epoxy to grab onto, and probably just scuff this gauge bezel up as well. And we'll epoxy that and pin that together and let it dry and cure. Then we'll be able to put our gauges in. So it's the next day, and we have the gauge pod all nice and epoxied in, so it's ready for the gauges. And we have a set from Glow Shift, and we have oil temperature, boost, vacuum, and also water temperature. And so what I think I want to do is have the vacuum boost gauge, then oil, and then water, just from my position, the most important. to see the quickest. So one of the nice things about the glow shift boost gauges is not only obviously you plug your sensor into each gauge, but we can daisy chain the power wires to each. So we don't have to connect up, in this case, 3 sets of wires. I only have to connect 1. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that off camera and get it all set, show you, and then we'll put it in the car. So now we have the gauges set in the trim bezel around the radio, and I'll take you in and show you what I've done. What I did was I pulled the radio out and actually went in and redid some of the wiring, and then I wired in our gauges. So we have them sitting here. So now what I want to do is go ahead and hook this back up and place it on. And so now what I can do is go ahead and put these screws and the little cover plates on, and we'll be good to go. So the finishing touch on the engine, of course, is the cover plate. And really all I did here was just give a coat of plastic paint. And I think it looks way better than it did before. Not a big fan of the greenish gray. We've got some stainless steel bolts. Tighten those down. So I used an aluminum colored paint, and that matches the plenum a little better and just, I think, ties everything together. So now that this is finished, what we're gonna do is go to the bottom of the engine and replace the oil pan gasket, because that's leaking. So underneath the car, what we want to do is we need to first pull off the torsion rods, and we're gonna loosen up the bolts to the transverse link or the lower control arm, and then need to drain the oil and just disconnect some of these power steering AC lines and loosen this up, and the steering column. And that will give us room so we can support the engine from top and then pull the oil pan off and replace the gasket. All right, just a little update. We've got the engine slung using ratchet straps that are double wrapped and well secured, and then we have the tension rods off, the oil's drained, and the transverse link or the lower control arm bolt is loose. So we're ready to undo the subframe and lower it down with the jack, and then that way I can get to the oil pan. So here we go. All right, so we're underneath the ZX, and these 2 bolts, hopefully you can see them right here, and this is on a transmission bracket behind the oil filter tree. We had to shave off a thin box wrench to get up in there, use a little bit of heat and a punch with a hammer so I could shock that bolt to get it undone. And that's solely so we can reach 2 oil pan bolts right behind here, those 2. So now that we have this loose, we're going to be able to go ahead and get this oil pan out. And we already pulled out the subframe, but had to put it in because I had my head under the engine and I didn't want any mistakes happening. So go ahead and pull those out and get this oil pan gasket changed. All right, so we've got the oil pan out finally. Took a little bit of work and also help from the forums, but the key was to cut off that bracket that we loosened the bolts to get a little bit of a gap. Well, I had to cut a little piece off of the top edge and then grind down the captive nut that was behind it. And then using one of these tools, which is great for anytime you have an oil pan that is adhered to the block with RTV, you hammer this in between, very carefully in between the oil pan and the block, and you can hammer it and then use it slightly to pry, and that popped it off. So now what we need to do is change the O-ring in the oil pickup tube. We've got that, so we're gonna go and take care of that. Also clean up the RTV off the bottom of the block. We've already cleaned it off of the pan, so that's ready. So we get back under this and get this finished. So we've got the oil pan in place, all sealed up. We even changed the seals on the power steering rack because this was leaking. And now what we need to do is work on the back of the engine, which means we need to pull the transmission. All right, so in order for us to get the transmission out, we need to pull the exhaust, we need to pull the drive shaft, and that's gonna allow us to drop the transmission out so we can check on the rear oil main seal, and then as well check the clutch and the flywheel, see how that's doing. But I think that's gonna call it for this episode, so thanks so much for watching. If you guys like what you see, consider subscribing and leave that thumbs up. See you next time.